Hello, I'm Wogglawooh, a rookie game artist who's currently trying to learn coding. Swordlake Entertainment is a two-person game studio that I started with my brother. And in order to make the cool and awesome best-selling games that we have planned for the future, I mean, you gotta dream big, right? I need to be able to do more than just art and 3D models. I started this video series a couple weeks ago where I talked about my experience with following Unity tutorials for beginners here on YouTube. Go check it out if you haven't already. It'll bring you up to speed on the whole situation. Anyway, let's move on to coding part 2. To continue the journey, I decided I was ready to tackle a bigger project. Something that wasn't just a simple retro-style game. I say simple, but in reality I would never be able to make them myself without a tutorial. And like a gift from the coding gods, CodeMonkey himself announced that he would be releasing a 10-hour-long video on how to make a cooking game, kinda like Overcooked. This was it! This was exactly what I had been looking for. It wasn't a question about if, but rather when I would do the tutorial and take my skills to the next level. So I waited, patiently, for him to release the video. And once it finally went live, I was on it like a hawk. I immediately watched the first hour or so, and then it took about a week for me to actually do anything. This whole project took me over 20 hours to finish, and I did it over the course of about 2 weeks. The video itself is targeted towards beginner/intermediate level programmers, or game developers, whatever. And I'll tell you right now that it's a good thing that I've done some other smaller games first, because even though he explains everything quite thoroughly, there were still more complex things that I did not understand at all. So, since I still think of myself as a beginner, I'd say it's more suited for intermediate learners who have a firmer grip on the basics. But if you think it looks fun and you're up for a challenge, feel free to give it a go. Even if it seems overwhelming at times, I promise you'll learn tons of new stuff and good coding practices. The whole tutorial is split up in smaller segments, so it's easy to go back in case you want to revisit something later. Now let's have a look at how this whole thing actually went on my end. The first part was obviously setting up the project. He recommended using the same Unity version as him, which I, of course, promptly ignored. My reasoning was that I didn't want to spend about an hour downloading yet another Unity version when I already have 3 different ones installed. I figured there probably wouldn't be that much of a difference either way, and thankfully I was right. I called this chapter 0 because this was all things that I already knew. Basically, he explained the layout and where you can find things, basic stuff that you need to navigate the software. Although, I did learn one very nice feature during this segment, and it's this little VSync button. What it does is that it limits the frame rate, so that during simple games like this, the computer doesn't go crazy because it's running at over 1000 frames per second. Very useful, and it solved the problem of my computer sounding like a jet engine whilst in an empty scene. Next step was to drag the first couple assets into the scene. Quite self-explanatory. My only issue with this was getting my hands on the assets, and that's just because I was kinda stupid. There was clearly a link in the description leading to his website where you could get the assets, but I was looking for a big download button or something, so I missed this button right here. And then when I finally found it, I downloaded the whole project files instead of just the assets, which was pretty unnecessary. With the files finally acquired, it was as simple as just dragging them into the scene. Then it was the camera's turn to get positioned correctly. CodeMonkey used the Cinemachine here, but I decided not to since it's just a static camera anyway. After this, the real fun began. And by fun, I mean adding Unity's new input system. This is such a useful feature and makes adding different types of inputs much easier. You just go in here and add new bindings for an action. That's it! Of course, you have to actually set it up somehow, but that's the general gist of it. With the input system in place, adding the player movement was next. You make a vector for where to go based on the input and then move the player character to that spot, yada yada yada. On top of that, there's also visual elements, like making the character rotate correctly and adding animations for idle and walking. Nothing too complicated, but compared to other tutorials, I do think it's nice that we're using the new input system here, because if you want to make a bigger game and allow for both keyboard and controller input, The new input system is the best way to do so. It's definitely worth looking deeper into if you're interested. Another very important part of this game, and also most other games, is interacting with stuff. What we did here was to create a raycast, essentially a laser, that points out from the player character to see if there's something in front of the player. You set an interact distance, and if you're within that distance, you can, in theory, interact with it. I can't say that I understood all of this perfectly, but I will say that it's very useful and that I'll be looking into it more later so that I can add it to my own games. The coolest part of the interaction was that we added so the counters change appearance when you stand in front of them. You can actually see that they are selected. I've never known how to make something like this, so it was very nice to see it working. Continuing on with the game, of course we would need somewhere to get the ingredients from. It's hard to make a burger or salad without any ingredients. So here I am trying to set up the container counter prefab, following the tutorial like I'm supposed to, when he says...
And also, by the way, over here on this counter, this one actually has an object sprite. This is the actual sprite in there, but for the selected we really don't want that. So if I enable this game object, here we've got the object sprite. Let's actually delete this.
And then he deleted the logo on the selected counter visual object. What I did was that I deleted the logo from the whole prefab. You can literally feel my confusion even when there's no sound. Luckily, my dumbass self knew how to fix it. I added an empty game object with a sprite renderer component, and then I added back the cheats logo. Phew! Now you see, the mistake I did here was that I didn't unpack the prefab before I tried to delete the logo. Therefore, it disappeared from every instance of the container counter. Don't do what I did, everyone. It'll save you some time and mental stability. Nothing much to say in this chapter. We implemented a new alternate interaction for cutting vegetables and a UI bar to show the progress. Then there were also recipes for what the ingredients would turn into, tomato to tomato slices, cheese to cheese slices, and so on. Also made a trash can to throw away plates and ingredients if you mess up somehow. This part was fairly easy. I'm calling this chapter 4.5 because I forgot to record this part, which is typical because this is where I messed up pretty badly. To explain what happened here, there are scripts for the scriptable object recipes, and here's what was supposed to happen.
So for that, let's actually just duplicate, so let's go inside our scriptable objects for the cutting recipe and let's duplicate this one, so Ctrl D. And let's name this one the frying recipe SO.
And while I was focused on what he was saying, I made the mistake of renaming the wrong script. So I basically messed up the existing script, rewrote it, and then it ruined a bunch of things in the project. Not only that, but I used the renaming feature in Visual Studio to rename a bunch of stuff, and now other scripts were wrong too. Now, luckily, I was able to fix it eventually, but it probably took about 40 to 50 minutes of me swearing and angrily spinning around in my chair before I got the game working again. Best part is that I wasn't recording because I thought at the start that nothing interesting is gonna happen anyway, so I'll skip it this time. Yeah, I shouldn't trust myself with that anymore. Making the plate counter wasn't anything too difficult, but I did run into some, let's say, interesting problems when I was setting up the UI for the ingredients on the plate. For some reason, the UI didn't display the ingredients properly and always had bread as the first one, no matter what was actually on the plate. But when you picked up the next ingredient, suddenly there were 3 icons, 2 that were correct, but also the bread. Always bread. Now I did figure out that the constant bread icon was from the icon template, but I could for the life of me not figure out why it was still there and why the first item didn't show up until you had picked up something else. I'll spare you the details of me frustratedly checking every line of code to see where the problem was, because eventually I found it. I had written icon template instead of icon transform, which created this weird bug that I had, but I fixed it. From this point forward, it was pretty much smooth sailing for the rest of the game. I dabbled in some shader graph stuff to make the delivery counter. I'm not completely new to the shader graph because I made a grass shader before, so it was a good reminder on how things work, and I did learn some new tricks. After that, we made the customer orders, which is randomly generated recipe UI that shows up on screen. I like UI stuff, so this was pretty fun. Adding sound was interesting because it was definitely a method I would have never conjured up on my own. All sounds are controlled with a sound manager script, which of course makes a lot of sense. So you add all the sounds to the sound manager script and then play it by using Unity events. The sound manager listens to all the events that require sounds and then plays it when it says to do so. It's more thorough than I'm making it sound, but that's the general gist of it. Furthermore, the game needs to have an ending in order to make a proper game loop. For this game, it ends when a timer runs out. This timer icon is another useful feature that I learned more about during this course, namely that you can take any sprite you want and set it to fill, then you just access the fill amount through a script. Super simple! Now this is my bread and butter. I don't know why, but I love me a good main menu and loading screen. It's quite self-explanatory, really. The main menu is in a new scene and there's a button for playing the game and another for quitting the game. The interesting part was adding the loading function. I honestly didn't understand it 100%, but basically when you press play, it would make sense to load the game scene right away, but if this were a much bigger game, the scene might load in before everything is actually ready, meaning that the whole game freezes for a second or two before you can do anything. This feels quite jarring if you're playing, so having a loading screen to stare at while the game is technically frozen feels a lot better. Like I said, this mostly applies to bigger games, but it's a good practice to make a loading screen just in case. Aside from a main menu and a loading scene, we also made a pause menu for when you're in the actual game. Here it basically just slows down the time in the game to 0, and then when you start it returns to normal again. Here we also reset static data, which I frankly have no idea what it is even though I thought of the whole thing, but I guess it's a good thing to reset it, I don't know. We're nearing the end, and one of the final features was to add an options menu where players can change the volume and rebind keys. You know, in case you're a psychopath and don't use WASD for some reason. I did run into a minor bug when I was working on the volume settings for the sound effects. The plan is that it's capped at 10 and then restarts at 0 if you press the button again, but mine went up to 11 before going back down to 0, which was pretty strange since the music behaved properly even though they basically used the same code. Turns out I had written the numbers wrong in the code, and once I fixed that, everything worked like it was supposed to. I did the whole rebinding keys part, but I skipped on adding controller rebinding because I simply don't have a controller hooked up to my computer, so I wouldn't be able to test it anyways. With the options menu out of the way, the only thing left was to add some polish. These included things like a warning for when the meat is about to burn, fixing the final visuals, a tutorial UI before the game starts, and proper UI when delivering recipes. I struggled a little bit with the delivery failed UI because the background didn't show up. And the problem was that it was set as transparent when he even mentioned in the video.
And also importantly, make sure you set the alpha to full.
I heard it and I did it, but for some reason it reset and then I forgot to do it the second time. But once it was working, the game was done. I'd done it! I'd finished the game! It works perfectly fine and it's actually pretty fun. I played it with my siblings for a while and I quickly learned that my sister does not perform well under stress. But anyway, that was the whole tutorial and I do have some final thoughts about it. Of course, this is a tutorial for beginners for a very simple game, so it won't be the best AAA game you've ever seen. Despite that, I have some fixes I'd like to do if I were to revisit the game. First off, I'd add a point system for the dishes, because if you want to reach a high score, you're gonna be making salads, and nothing but salads because everything else takes too long. There's really no incentive to make a mega burger that takes twice as long when they're both worth only 1 point. Furthermore, I'd like to add a restart button when the game is over, because the way things are now, you're just left staring at the game over screen when the timer is up. Of course, you can go out to the main menu and load back in that way, but I noticed that when my non-gamer sister was playing, that it's not really clear that you should do that. Finally, I want to make the sound setting buttons to a slider or something instead. Either that or make it 2 buttons, one for volume up and one for volume down. The singular button works, of course, but it's a bit tedious to cycle through all the options if you want to lower the sound just a little bit. These are just slight changes that I would prefer. All in all, this was a great and thorough tutorial that's available completely for free. I learned a ton of new stuff and also some good coding practices like keeping functionality separate from the visuals and so on. The mistakes along the way were also good because they forced me to try and understand the code better in order to find the mistakes that I'd made. Having done this, I feel a little more confident in my abilities, but there's still a long way to go before I would be able to conjure up a game like this on my own. If you enjoyed this video and want to follow my coding journey, please consider subscribing. Also check out our other videos about our own game, Mr. Winter Bay. It's a massive visual novel RPG with city building mechanics. Like seriously, it's massive. And it's all thanks to the countless dialogue options in the game. You can play the demo for free both on Steam and itch.io. And if you like it, it'd mean the world to us if you'd wishlist it on Steam. More wishlists means more exposure and more people playing our game. Because that's what game development is all about. Thank you so much for watching this far, and I'll be seeing you next time.